Hello, everyone. Welcome. We've got a good crowd coming in here right now. And my name is Jennifer Adams. I'm the editor-in-chief with Signature Leadership by Knowledge Hook, and very happy to welcome you here. My partner, Nika, is going to share the screen, and we are going to get started. So welcome to all of you. It is our first Signature Leadership session, our first SEL Global Leadership Series webinar this year, and very happy to have you here with us. Wanted to acknowledge that this is 9/11 and a very difficult time for many, and certainly appropriate to be having a topic like we have today, SEL in conflict and crisis settings and beyond. And today I just want to give people the sense we're going to be broadening the research that we are going to learn from NYU and from OECD. We're also going to be having the conversation about how the research can impact the way that we are teaching in our districts in North America or in Europe or in other parts of the world where we have children that are coming from crisis settings or are living or have lived through trauma. So it's going to be a big, broad conversation, and we're super happy to have you here. Nika, next slide, please. For those of you that are new to Signature Leadership by Knowledge Hook and SEL Global Leadership Series, we have 3 partners and actually 4 now. Our first is Signature Leadership by Knowledge Hook. You'll notice for those of you that have been here before, the portal has a new look. You're welcome to go in. Over on the right-hand bottom, you have an opportunity to see all of the amazing webinars that we have done over the last few years since before the pandemic. So you're welcome to jump in there. The accounts are free, of course, and to use any of the content that is there. Our next partner is Karanga, and Karanga is the Global Alliance for Social Emotional Learning and Life Skills. It is a group that came together in 2018 and came up with an amazing statement around the vision and the mission for this group. And it's really an opportunity to take a look at what's happening globally in social emotional learning and to learn from each other. Our second partner is Salzburg Global Seminar, and we have Dominic Regester here, who is with that organization, an amazing think tank that emerged after the Second World War with the idea of developing current and future leaders and to shape a better world, and we certainly continue to need that support. And our last group is the OECD, and we have Kat here from the OECD. They have been partnering with us, and super happy to have them on board. Who's with us today? We have registrants from 4 Canadian provinces and territories, from 8 states throughout the United States, and from 24 different countries. So lots of interest, and we really look forward to having this discussion. I am going to give you a little bit of a sense of who's around the table with us. We have from NYU, we have Larry Aber, Yeon, and Rena Deitz, who's not on, the picture is not here, but we have her as one of our panelists, and Catharina Gress-Wright from the OECD, who's been doing lots of work in this area. And finally, Dominic Regester, who is a regular facilitator on these series. So over to you, Dominic. Excited to get the conversation started.
Thanks, Jen, and welcome, everybody. Thank you, Jen, for acknowledging that we're holding this event on September the 11th. The other reason why this time of year is particularly apposite for this kind of conversation is the 9th of September, earlier this week, is the UN's International Day for Protecting Education from Attack. So this topic couldn't be more timely or relevant. There is also, I think everyone on this call will be familiar with different facets of the broader research around SEL and the positive impact that social and emotional learning programs will have on, obviously, on social and emotional competencies, but also on things like school climate, school atmosphere, and academic attainment and academic outcomes. There is less research around the value and impact of SEL in context of crisis and conflict. So this is why the work that Larry and Rena and Yeon have been doing with New York University Global Ties Project is so important and has been pioneering and sort of blazing a trail in this space for many years. Larry, the way that we're going to run the session is Larry will give a brief opening remark in a second, then Yeon will give a short presentation framing their research and some of the evidence that they've been looking at. There'll then be a chance for Rena, Yeon, and Larry to sort of discuss the presentation. We'll take any questions that have come up in the chat at that point. We'll then pass to Kat who's going to give a presentation about some of the OECD's relevant work in this space. And again, then have a bit of a conversation, deal with any questions, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. So please feel free to post questions in the chat. It's really helpful if when you do that, you post them to everyone rather than just to panelists and hosts and panelists, because then everybody gets to see the question. Equally, if while the conversation's going on, it reminds you of research that you've seen or articles that you've read or written that you think would be of interest and relevance to the group, then feel free to post links in the chat. These roundtables have been fantastically useful for that kind of knowledge exchange and sharing of resources. And thank you to everyone who started to introduce themselves in the chat as well. This is a growing and expanding community, so please do feel free to all take advantage of that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass to Larry Aber initially. Larry, thank you so much for doing this, and really looking forward to learning about the work and hearing from the three of you at NYU.
Thank you to Knowledge Hook. Thank you to Salzburg Seminar, Karanga, and OECD for really expanding what began as a North American movement in SEL to much more global relevance, and most recently to the most vulnerable kids in the world who are experiencing and being exposed to armed conflict. The only thing I'm going to add right now is that we are so delighted that OECD is developing its very robust research agenda. And if you learn one thing today from this presentation, I hope it's that you see the value of comparative work, where we don't assume that all children and experiences in SEL are the same across cultures, but we also don't assume that they aren't. We actually investigate that. What's common, unique, and for everybody. Okay. Now the meat of our work is going to be presented by Yeon Kim, and then Rena Dietz and I will be available for questions and answers when the time comes. So over to you, Yeon.
Thank you for that introduction. And so today we would like to discuss the importance of and the evidence on social and emotional learning in the conflict and crisis settings so far. And this presentation is only a snippet from the forthcoming chapter in the Handbook of Social and Emotional Learning to be published this fall. You can take a look at the preprint version in this link by following the QR code, and Mina will be sharing the link in the chat as well. So just a bit of background, the children affected by conflict and crisis are not just a small number of select population living in an active conflict zone or refugees. According to ECW, a UN agency, as of 2023, conflict and crisis affected access to basic services, including education, of 224 million children across 73 countries. That is about 10% of the entire world's child population. And with the rise of global conflict and rapidly increasing climate disasters and the global pandemic, as we have seen with COVID-19, these numbers already has and likely to continue to increase and can affect anywhere, anyone, and anywhere. And these children's education and their lives affected not just by the chaos and security concerns from the crisis and conflict, but also other risk factors are common in low-resource crisis settings, like teacher absenteeism and school closings and schedule interruptions in schools, as we have seen in the COVID-19 situation, as well as poverty, child labor, and needs for frequent migration. And extensive research have shown that the exposure to violence, trauma, and displacement and unpredictable conditions resulted from the conflict and crisis affect these children's not just well-being and safety, but also their long-term learning and development. So the SEL in conflict and crisis settings has been enthusiastically embraced by global humanitarian sector as a strategy to bolster resilience and proactively address risks and develop necessary social and emotional competencies in conflict and crisis affected contexts. And there are largely two types and approaches to social and emotional learning interventions in this type of context. So the first one is the climate-targeted social and emotional learning interventions, typically added to academic programming in humanitarian settings, either formal schooling or informal alternative education settings. And this doesn't include the direct instruction of social emotional learning, but targets fostering a positive learning environment to enhance the impact of academic programming and promote learning and mental health through providing positive environment that is, good good to facilitate social emotional learning processes. So these programs, in fact, directly target the positive learning environment and academic outcomes and mental health. The other types of social and emotional learning programs in this type of context is skill-targeted social and emotional learning, like mindfulness practices or specifically designed social and emotional learning curricula. And these programs directly target developing social and emotional competencies to help children in conflict and crisis affected context to navigate the challenging circumstances and promote positive development and learning. Oops. So the climate-targeted social and emotional learning added to academic programming so far in this context have shown positive impact on improving their learning environment, perception of the positive learning environment, as well as their academic outcomes. However, the evidence so far have not shown its impact on improving mental health. For the skill-targeted SEL, so far have shown somewhat mixed evidence depending on context and population and program, but the emerging evidence have shown some effective programs on improving social and emotional competencies directly. But it is we have yet to see the impact of academic and mental health outcomes of these skill-targeted social and emotional learning programs. And there are a lot of gaps in the research so far, given that it is a relatively a new and emerging emerging research area. We do need a lot more evidence on who are the populations this social and emotional learning can support, and how this works, whether it is through the supporting SEL, so social and emotional competencies, or directly supporting their mental health. And we also need a lot more information to the evidence to be actionable to improve social and emotional learning interventions on the implementations and the context, as well as the better measurement of the social and emotional competencies in these different types of contexts and populations. And how can we better support the teachers and education system as a whole in order for the SEL programming in this context to be more effective. But despite that, SEL research in the CACs are in early stage, it has already shown that SEL research from this context can make significant contribution to SEL knowledge base as a whole, bringing in unique perspectives and theories and innovative solutions. This is just an example. Our work in Lebanon, working with the Lebanese government, have identified 10 priority social and emotional competencies they would like to build into their national curriculum. And as you can see, there are a lot of common key social emotional competencies that are part of this framework, like the working memory, inhibitor control, and so on. But there are also really unique social and emotional competencies that they prioritize, such as flexibility, respect for environment, and crisis management skills that are reflective of the needs of the context that is going through conflict and crisis, and can really inform how we think about social and emotional learning in the context of crisis, but also that could inform our research as a whole in the global knowledge base. And there is also ongoing effort to incorporate these new skills and align it with the existing knowledge base in a broader SEL research as a whole, and how we can incorporate this knowledge to expand our understanding of social and emotional learning and how to better support children's development. So I'm going to stop there and leave with the three take-home messages here. I know I'm over time, so I'm going to hand it over to Dominic for the Q&A.
Will you bring, hi, Yeon, that was excellent. Thank you. Will you bring the three key messages back up?
Yes.
That's a useful slide to leave up for a little bit longer.
Mhm.
So as Jen said, please do feel free to put questions in the chat. I have one opening question, really, please. From your research, despite the lack of compelling evidence that you brilliantly summarized in this, do you get a sense that there is an increase in SEL programs in conflict and crisis contexts at the moment, or are kind of implementers and program providers waiting for the evidence to catch up?
So if I were to jump in quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Reina and Larry, I do see there is continuing investment and increase in the SEL programming in this type of context. And because the evidence, lack of evidence is because it is relatively new and in the early stage in terms of generating rigorous evidence. But the interest in this area as a promising strategy is continuing, and there is an increasing evidence also coming out. Rina and Larry, if you were to
Rina.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely an increase in both programming and research that's ongoing. I will share a link in the chat from a systematic review that I conducted in 2020 that shows actually the rise in the number of publications on social emotional learning in these contexts. And the programming is actually ahead of the research. So there is definitely a rise. Funders are requiring it as part of their mandate in their proposals, and programmers are looking at different ways to integrate it and sort of rebrand and remodel some of the programs that they've been doing in the past as well.
There's also been considerable concern about whether some of the values and skills that make SEL a very good thing in the West, without substantial change, could feel foreign. So, for instance, in our work in Niger, we discovered that talking about mindfulness programs made them think of religious colonialism that was being imposed on them, and they didn't like that one darn bit. But I think that the notion that the research can contribute to both semi-universal and semi-specific, culture-specific knowledge, we have to be working on both of those at the same time.
Dominic, we have a couple of interesting comments coming in from the chat, and Jean Clinton has mentioned, she says, context matters. Without safety and the presence of unpredictability, kids can't learn. To help them with SEL skill of controlling what they can control must be the target. No. Jean is an amazing child psychologist, psychiatrist, and I think Yeon, when you were showing when you were showing the wheel with Lebanon, one of those targeted areas on their framework was crisis management, respect for the environment. So that whole crisis management, what are they able to control and what are they not being able to control? So just a quick comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The Lebanon framework is really showing what they prioritize as a core skills that is non-academic skills for their children to develop. And this is part of the national curriculum that they are building onto. So having that more about crisis awareness and management and the flexibility to adapt in the changing circumstances, they are really focusing on developing those skills, which we haven't really seen in the Western developed country context, but it makes a lot of sense, and that can actually inform our understanding about what the social emotional skills as should prioritize beyond this conflict affected context.
That's great. Thanks. And one more quick comment before we go on to an amazing presentation by Kat. Ricardo Castro asks, how have education authorities, Ministry of Education's taken the integration of SEL in classrooms? And so I think that goes back to your first slide that was showing there was kind of two different approaches, right? The one that was program centric and the other was more of an embedded approach. And I found that interesting, the academic programming where SEL is embedded right into the different subject areas. You're saying that there are some academic outcomes and improvements of mental health that were a little bit more documented, it sounds like. So just a comment on what you're seeing maybe.
So I think there's two things that we might be talking about here. One is looking at the role of the education authorities. I think, Ricardo, I think that's speaking to your question a bit. And education authorities, both in the classroom level, teachers and students, as you mentioned, but also the Ministry of Education, have taken it differently in different places. And one example is the Ministry of Education in Ukraine has adopted social emotional learning and mental health and well-being incredibly well, and it's been universally integrated into the Ministry of Education's approach and is really looking at addressing children who are affected by conflict in Ukraine and those who have left Ukraine. Other ministries, as Larry mentioned, in Niger, the language, and the same is true in Somalia, some other work that has been done on social emotional learning. Some other authorities see this as sort of imposed from the West or religiously aligned. And so it may need to be reframed and restructured. And that's sort of going back to what Yeon was saying before about the Lebanon specific competencies that we're focusing on. It really needs to be the language that we're using as well as the specific competencies need to be really well aligned with the context and the needs there. And then one quick note on what is on your screen right now in terms of the climate targeted versus skill targeted SEL. These are two different approaches to building, social emotional well-being and social emotional skills. Climate targeted are kind of general approaches within the classroom that may or may not be really targeting skills, whereas the skill targeted are really building concrete skills and strategies that students can use in their everyday life. And so this is sort of jumping the gun, but one of the promising practices is merging the two, having that underpinning climate targeted SEL, which as we see might build positive learning environment, which can allow for building the specific social emotional skills.
I completely agree. And the only thing I'd add that we haven't talked about here is a program can't work if the kids don't receive it. So we've found that unless kids attend school, they're not getting exposed adequately to the social emotional learning problems to have an effect. But if the kids attend school, then it's very effective. So that's another feature of why things work sometimes and don't sometimes.
Just before we do bring Kat on, I think there was a question in the chat about defining crisis, which I think is interesting for everyone. And is there a kind of working academic definition of what constitutes a crisis, or is it defined by the people experiencing it? And it's different for different contexts.
Naeem gave a great example. She said, do you mean conflict, climate, economic, emotional, political, and so on? Is it any of those? Is it all of those? It would be great to hear your thinking on that.
There are definitely different, criteria. The ECW number that we presented is they are using specific criteria, whether the services, basic executive services are affected or not in a country that is lower resource or settings. But there, I do think with the rise of the climate disaster and the COVID pandemic, it is affecting a much larger population, and it depends on the definition of crisis-affected population. It's also including the host communities. So we can think about different ways to approach these types of risk factors and populations.
Thanks, Yeon. And we've got some great questions coming up, but I'm going to hand it over to Dominic because we want to get Kat in there and listen to her research. So Dominic, over to you.
Well, just to bring, I think, pass straight to Kat in the interests of time for the presentation around OECD's relevant work. And then we'll have a sort of specific questions for Kat. And then the final part of the hour can be for a broader discussion. And there are some great questions coming in the chat.
So I'm going to be speaking very briefly about our results from our recent survey in Ukraine. So the OECD in 2023 undertook the survey on social emotional skills, the second round, and Ukraine was participated at a national level, and 19 out of 27 regions participated. The remaining ones were either occupied territories or were unable to join. So just to give you sort of a brief overview. So the survey on social emotional skills, like I said, undertook 2 rounds, and we used the following framework that you can see in front of you, where we looked at 15 skills across 5 different key areas or domains. And I won't go into detail about each one of them, but just that you can think of them broadly grouped as the following. So 2 domains, collaboration, engaging with others, that have to do with initiating and maintaining relationships. 2 other domains, task performance and emotional regulation, that have to do with self-management, so managing tasks, homework, things like that, and then managing one's own feelings, be it anger or stress. And then the last domain, open-mindedness, is really about sort of approaching how children approach ideas and the world and other people. And so across the 2 rounds, we surveyed 23 different sites, some at a country level, some at like a city or regional level. In 2023, we covered 70,000 students, representing 2.5 million students across the world, and we surveyed almost 5,000 kids in Ukraine. Now, the survey of social emotional skills assessed 15-year-olds, as well as their teachers and principals in their schools, and there was an optional component for surveying 10-year-olds as well as parents. And Ukraine did all of it. They did 15-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and parents. And I'll be talking about mostly the 15-year-old data today and some of the 10-year-old data. So this first slide about the data is basically about some interesting findings that came out in relation to Ukraine. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. And this first one is about how skills change by age. So basically what changes we saw between 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds. And what we found was that in older students reported lower levels of most skills. And here's 5 of them just to give you an indication. And we saw this basically across almost all sites and almost all skills. But we didn't see the same drops in Ukraine. We saw slightly less drops in trust, but for optimism and energy, those were the lowest age gaps of any site of the 16 sites that we surveyed in 2023. And so and this is interesting because trust, optimism, and energy are also some of the findings that relate the most to health and well-being outcomes, mental and physical health. So we don't have any pre-war baseline data. We only surveyed Ukraine in 2023. We don't directly compare countries. But one of the theories and the questions we had about this finding was whether actually much of the drop that you typically see between age 10 and 15 has already happened at age 10 in Ukraine. that because of the war and the conflict context, the younger children are sort of growing up faster. And so you don't see as big of a drop. This next slide is about the relationship between health and well-being outcomes and social emotional skills. And so again, we saw an interesting pattern where Ukraine was a bit different than other sites. So what we found was that skills related to emotional control, emotional regulation, and then trust and energy were the ones that had the strongest relationship with physical and mental health outcomes. So for example, kids who reported higher levels of these skills reported higher health behaviors. That's like getting 8 hours or more of sleep, eating vegetables, exercising, not drinking alcohol or smoking cigarettes. And in Ukraine, we saw that in several skills, the relationship was even stronger. So optimism, stress resistance, emotional control, and trust, for example, were stronger predictors of physical health behaviors for Ukrainians, 15-year-olds, than they were for other kids. Similarly, we saw a relationship across all sites for psychological well-being. So this is where we asked kids what their mood and well-being was like over the preceding 2 weeks. And we saw, again, a relationship between emotional regulation and this outcome. And again, the pattern was a bit different from Ukraine. So similar for optimism, lower for energy. But if you notice for stress resistance and trust, the relationship, it was an even stronger predictor of psychological well-being in Ukraine than for the other sites on average. Last, we looked at test and class anxiety. Again, there was a relationship across most sites. Here, Ukraine is in some cases similar to other countries and other sites, but again, we see a different relationship with trust and optimism, where there's a stronger relationship in Ukraine than elsewhere. So what might this mean? I think the key messages from this would be that in Ukraine, it seems trust, and I guess I should define it as trust, that we meant students' tendencies to believe that others have good intentions, to forgive others when they've done wrong, and to trust other people. And that seems to have been a really strong predictor of particularly mental health and physical health outcomes in Ukraine. And again, emotional regulation, especially optimism, seems to really matter in war and conflict context, where it again was a stronger predictor of physical and mental health outcomes in Ukraine compared to other sites. And the question I put here is, the optimism is, I think it was a particularly interesting finding for us. And we discussed about whether this has some connection with idea of hope for the future. As optimism, we defined it as the expectation that one's own future and life in general is going well and will continue to go well. So this skill of optimism seems to potentially be related to this idea of having faith and hope that in the future and that things will be okay. So those were my 2 things I wanted to talk about. And if you would like to see the whole report, this is the one that is currently out. We will have another report coming out in October that delves more specifically into school and teaching practices and school climate. But this is available for you for now.
Thank you, Kat. Can I ask, was there a history of SEL programs in Ukraine pre-war, or does the survey sort of look at, in front of a better phrase, innate skills before there have been specific interventions?
Excellent question. So we do, so there's 2 parts to that. In terms of what is the history of SEL in Ukraine, our understanding is that it was pretty sporadic before. Like there are some NGOs like EdCamp Ukraine, Osvitoria that have been implementing SEL in the country for a while, but it's not yet sort of integrated throughout the system, which is typically very, very academically focused. Although, as Rena pointed out, the ministry is very interested in reforming that. In terms of the next question, I think relates a bit more to this data. So this is a cross section of a representative sample of students across Ukraine. So some of them might have had some kind of SEL intervention, some of them might not. We did ask teachers about their attitudes, preparedness, and ability to teach social emotional skills and provide social emotional learning. And that is some of the data that we'll be analyzing for the second report.
This is the report that's coming out in
October. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that report. Certainly, we've had discussions with Kat's colleague Noemi, and the idea is that we will have a follow-up session that will dive right into that report. So something to be looking forward to for everyone on the line today.
Can I ask a question to all four of you, please, then, about context and adaptation? So, I mean, Larry and Rena and Yeon, you referenced the work in Niger around healing classrooms, and that was a project which ran concurrently in several different countries, wasn't it, I think? And were you adapting the nature of the SEL intervention for those different countries? Or is there a feeling that in contexts of crisis and conflict, there are certain universal interventions that can be made, which would track across all different contexts, which would then help with speed of deployment and speed of putting the intervention in place? Or do they need to be specifically contextualized? And the sort of second part of the question for Kat is because you were surveying, the OECD was surveying the same sort of buckets of skills, weren't you, across all of the different sites? Do you see particularly compelling evidence that context that impacts significantly on the prevalence of different skills and how students are developing that?
On your first question, Dominic, and my colleagues may or may not agree with me, my own feeling is that we always should be going in thinking about adaptation. But if we change the intervention too much, then it's no longer evidence-based. So how do you manage adapting it and keeping it its essentials close enough to say, yeah, that worked? And Rena and Yeon, I don't know if you have positions on this.
So I can speak a little bit to the adaptation of healing classrooms and from the content side. So at that time, I was actually working on the content development. So at that point, we were really, as Larry was saying, adapting what existed. I think Larry and I may disagree on this, so feel free to chime in and argue with me on the line. But I'm of the mindset at this point that adaptation is insufficient, in fact, and that's a large part of why we haven't seen these overwhelmingly positive effects. And so rather than creating, revising what has been done and successful in, say, the US, I would advocate for developing from the ground up with informing it with evidence. And that is usually coming from a more global and often Western evidence base, but pairing those two, so really designing from the ground up. And there are some fantastic examples of that. I can put a link in the chat to research in Nigeria from the ESA lab on their adaptation and sort of on the ground up design of the SEL kernels work. And I'm happy to chat about that from the measurement side as well, but I will stop in the interest of time and let Larry argue with me.
I get a chance to do that every day. We don't have to do that.
I think there is a difference between adaptation and implementation of the program packages and adaptation and implementation of the program approaches and target
That's a good point.
So I do think the implementing, utilizing and base the interventions designs on the existing evidence and adapting it and making it applicable and acceptable in the context, that process itself is an adaptation, which is much needed process. But I agree with Rina. There's a lot of difference between the between countries and populations and cultures. So we do need to, at this point, really pay attention to what is actually acceptable and feasible in the different contexts, what is desirable in different cultures, and so on. And I'll hand it over to Catharina.
Yeah, I'll definitely add some thoughts to that. So I think your question, Dominic, is a bit of one about like what kind of variations did we see between different sites and where did we see common patterns? And like we certainly saw common patterns. Like I said, in almost all sites, emotional regulation was very strongly related to health and well-being outcomes. But there was just variation between sites in terms of how strong that was. But I would make 2 points where we did also see variation, and sometimes in surprising ways. So the first one I would say is that actually when it comes to differences between groups, like differences between socioeconomically advantaged and disadvantaged students, between girls and boys. So for example, some of the largest gender differences in life satisfaction we saw in Helsinki, in Finland, and which I think surprised some people. And we also saw huge gender differences in places like Latin America, like Chile and Bogota, which is perhaps a little bit less surprising. But for example, in Ukraine, we saw very little. In terms of life satisfaction, no significant gender differences in life satisfaction or satisfaction relationships. And also quite surprisingly, Ukraine, for example, reported above average physical and mental health outcomes that compared to the average across sites. So sometimes there was variation, and it was really quite surprising. So that, like, I think that maybe sort of answered your question. That there were definitely things, to borrow, I think, Larry's phrase, like there was things that were common across sites, and there were also definitely things that were unique and would benefit, I think, from further exploration and research.
Kat and Yeon and Rina and Larry, some of the comments that are coming in and questions are coming in around how do we have adults that are prepared, whether it's teachers in classrooms, et cetera, to be teaching social emotional skills. And we did a great session, I think in the springtime, about the research around teachability of SEL. But maybe a comment from your thinking from your experiences in countries that are in crisis and conflict areas. How are they preparing their adults, whether it's teachers or informal workers or parents, to help children develop their social emotional skills? Are you seeing anything there, and is any of that applicable for teachers that are not on the front lines like many of those teachers would be?
So I think both Yeon and I put some responses in the chat that I would highly recommend folks look at. I also included some links to some of the sort of best practices, I would say, in terms of supporting teachers. One of the major gaps and challenges in these contexts is exactly that, is preparing teachers and is providing teachers with their own supports. So if you think back to the graphic that Yeon showed us with the various circles with the kind of students in the middle and then the teachers are facing massive challenges of their own in crisis and conflict settings. So they are often displaced. They have often experienced atrocities, and they're often not formally trained teachers. And now they're not only being asked to serve the role of teacher, but they're also being asked to serve a plethora of other roles, counselor, among, social worker. They're asked to do everything for children. And so providing for their own well-being and helping them build their own social emotional skills is vital and has been often overlooked. So often the training is about how teachers can provide for students, but not really looking at their own training. And one example of this that I'll speak to is the Thriving Through Play training, which I put a link to in the chat, which was initially developed for Ukrainian teachers. What we found in the evaluation of that program was that teachers were saying, this is the first time we've ever been taught any way to address our own well-being. So if teachers themselves don't have these skills, they're not able to then bring that into the classroom.
I'll add one concrete thing about it too, which is teachers don't get paid. So there's they're hired for X amount, but every week or month it may not come through, and so the tentative nature of the financial support that they have, many therefore have to take off, be absent from school to run a little corner grocery or sundries stand, that kind of thing. So
Yeah, just to add to that, sorry. There is a lot of investment on the children's learning and well-being in this type of context, as this is a very important policy outcomes for to take care of the children's rights. But in the humanitarian context specifically, there is limited investment on teachers' well-being. They are seen often as just a function or facilitator for the children to learn. But without the investing in the teachers, the children cannot really learn, as we have highlighted. So we do need a lot more investment and research in this area, and a little bit of shift in the policy discussion around education to prioritize teacher workforce and their well-being as well.
And I'll just jump in on that. I mean, this is coming more in the second report, so I can't go into great detail about it now. But one thing we did look at is teachers' well-being and job satisfaction, but also their use of particular coping mechanisms to deal with work-related stress. And we're seeing some interesting patterns emerging that, again, seem to affirm what the research says about how teachers' own well-being, their own social and emotional competencies affect their ability to help kids. So things like, some of the coping skills we ask about have to do with emotional regulation kind of things, like approaching problems optimistically, setting realistic goals, practicing good human relation skills. So definitely it is something that's not being addressed yet as well as it should be, but we are seeing it's very important in Ukraine as well as in a variety of the middle income and as well as high income countries that we look at.
There was great work done in Mexico in the sort of early 2000s that looked at the importance of SEL programs for teacher mental health before you can roll the programs out for students. And I think the Construyete initiative that Atentamente and other organizations led in Mexico started as an intervention to support teacher stress and teacher mental health and well-being. There have been some really great comments coming in, which some of which have only gone to the panelists, so they haven't been able to see. Not everyone's been able to see them, but I wanted to highlight a couple that Dan has been sharing and ask for your collective comments on the point around adaptation, not only being about the curriculum and the content, but also needing to adapt the implementation approach. And what experience you've seen or had around that?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question, and it's so challenging. The implementation approach needs to change in terms of the content, in terms of the activities that are just done, that are implemented, and then sort of this broader question in terms of the actual implementation approach and strategy. And so in Ukraine, for example, everything was done remotely. And so we were training Ministry of Education teacher trainers all through Zoom. Whereas in the past, of course, that would have been done in person. So there's not a one size fits all for crisis and conflict affected contexts. That would not work in Niger, for example. And rather instead, it's reacting to the realities in the context in which you're working and adjusting your expectations. So one of the challenges in Niger that Larry alluded to is lack of attendance. And that's not just in Niger, that's in any crisis and conflict affected contexts, that children are not coming to school. Maybe they're enrolled, but maybe they come in once a week. And so figuring out alternatives, whether it's ways to address the challenges they have in accessing school or more kind of modular approaches that might allow for the development of skills, even though they're not physically in school all that often, but really being creative in the way that we're thinking about developing a social emotional learning curriculum. It may not be curriculum in the traditional sense.
Just to mention that there's also, of course, a hidden curriculum everywhere. It's not like the choices between evidence-based explicit SEL and nothing. It's between evidence-based explicit SEL and non-evidence-based implicit SEL, known as culture. And so when you were saying, are there other SEL activity going on in the country? I think you were referring to Ukraine, Dominic. Yeah, the whole culture is sending messages. You know, the joke about the teacher is trying to get two kids from fighting and pulls one up by the hair, slaps them on the bottom and said, "I said use your words." So there's a disjoint.
And I'll chime in on that because again, it's more something we explore in the second report. But we looked at the parent data where we only have a few sites, but we have Ukraine and Peru and as two of our sites where we collected parent data, and then we were seeing some interesting variation. We asked the parents like to sort of rank how important they think certain skills are, and also how important they think literacy and numeracy are. And what we've noticed, for example, is that in Ukraine there is some interesting findings with a lot of the parents all value persistence and curiosity and things like that, but literacy and numeracy is a bit lower in Ukraine, and that might be just wonder if that has something to do with the context of the crisis. It's not that it's not valued; it absolutely is, but there seems to be something where the culture and the sort of what the parents is being valued and considered a priority might have shifted a little bit in the context of Ukraine right now, which suggests, as Larry says, that yes, there's going to be a whole lot of implicit priorities and attitudes that are surrounding that kids are hearing and getting, regardless of whether there's a curriculum or not.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is why it is really important to understand what the contextual needs are and what the community desires to have for their children to have. So, for example, in our work and the qualitative work in Niger, the program that we have been providing was really focused on emotional regulation and executive function skills that would help them to learn. But what parents said that they want their children to learn is the character development and moral development to be a good Muslim and citizens of the community. So there is that mismatch and how the mixed messages that children are getting. So in order for us to provide effective SEL, we need to understand what the culture and context is requiring for children to learn and adapt our approach to it.
It's an excellent point. Thank you. I suppose that was sort of part of one of the big challenges in this work must be that the very fact that it's a response to a crisis context creates a sort of necessity of urgency, and all of these issues around adaptation and designing culturally specific interventions and things like that take time to build up. And so in the research that you've seen, do you find a kind of interesting balance or models of great practice between speed of deployment and then also taking the time to do something which is very specifically culturally contextualized?
I'm going to start to answer that in a slightly different way. Right now, we have 500 or 600 impact evaluations of SEL in North America and Europe. We have 20. How many, Rena? Rena's the expert counter on the number of trials that we have there. We simply are at such an early stage in such an urgent context. And what I find really encouraging is the degree to which teachers and local education administrators and NGOs like the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, which Rena worked on and we worked with, worked for and we worked with, they really have a commitment to using the evidence where it exists and where it doesn't exist, participating in creating the evidence. So that's a background to your question, Dominic, which is we're still trying to, after a flood, get the door open, not yet shovel the living room out.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think there has been pretty rapid changes in approaches to SEL and research in this context. There was a very rapid deployment SEL in about 10 years ago, starting 10 years ago, mostly transporting what is existing to different contexts. And now we are seeing those large, and we did a bunch of RCTs and like large scale studies that haven't shown a lot of impacts. So now that is actually shifting very quickly into more grounded approaches with a strong partnership with the local governments and local organizations. And we are seeing that changes. I think the challenge here is because there is limited evidence, some of the, funders and the global actors are hesitant to invest in SEL in this context. For the extensive process of developing and working with the local culture and populations. So there is a chicken and egg problem. We don't have enough evidence to support the investment, but without investment, we don't have evidence.
Well, I have no doubt that this conversation is going to hopefully inspire some of those funding organizations to get in there and do some more research. Lots of promising practices, and I am going to. It's hard to imagine, but we're almost at the top of the hour. I'm going to ask my colleague Nika to share her screen, and Dominic, maybe a quick thank you to our incredible panelists.
Yeah, I mean, Larry, Yeon, and Rena, thank you so much for sharing all the work from New York University and your research. And Kat, this partnership with OECD across the different SEL leadership series this year has just got richer and richer. So thank you very much for being here. And we look forward to doing one more in collaboration when the October report comes out.
Thank you so much. And Nika, I'm just going to get you to go to the bottom of the slide. This was the session for the September the 11th. And just wanted to highlight, as I mentioned earlier on, we've had a number of sessions that really get at this whole idea of teachability. And there were so many questions that came up in the chat saying, what do we know about teachability? Is there evidence that it makes a difference? How can we support our teachers? There's a great webinar that we did last April. And you can see that on the Signature Leadership portal that we introduced to you and that you registered on for this session. So a huge thanks to all of you. A great way to start the school year for school years in the Northern Hemisphere. They're starting in September, and we really look forward to continuing this conversation. We'll see you in October. We'll see you in November. Take care, everyone. Thank you.